You know my old saying, I may be old and gray and in the way, but I don't care what people say. Broadway Bob is here to stay. Thank you.
Hi everybody, all my hot rod and motorcycle friends. I'm happy to be here. I'm kind of replacing TC. He wanted to be here and he was going to give a speech, but he's having a problem recovering from major surgery. So anyway, I just want to thank you and tell you I'm happy to be here. And at 88, I'm really happy to be here. I started drag racing at 16. I had a 1941 Plymouth with a Chrysler 6 and an Edmunds flathead. I got talked into a race with Al Pfeiffer, the cool guy with the shiny new 50 Mercury Coupe. I won and the Merc soon had a caddy engine. We became lifetime friends. In 1952 and 53, Andy Granatelli leased an old airstrip at Halfdale, Illinois. I had a 1942 Buick Century straight 8. It had dual carbs and header stock. I ported the head, left the head gasket out. That's all I could afford. On a good day, it could run 96. I could beat all the new V8s except Chris Karamazini's 32 Roadster with an Olds V8. Chris later became the Golden Greek and first over 200. Next, I helped John Journo build a 1951 Triumph drag bike. Turned the head around for Ram Air. It was the first bike in the Chicago area to go over 125 miles. My friends Dennis Rollane and John Botera were founding members of SEMA. In 1953, they arranged a meeting at the Kenosha County Sheriff's Department. Hot rodders from Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan were invited. We formed the Great Lakes Timing Association. At first, it didn't work out. Then Broadway Bob Metzler opened Great Lakes Dragway in 1955. My Buick developed fuel supply problems and was outclassed by the 1956 factory hot rods. I got into motorcycles. In the fall of 1956, I won the bike class. I went to Santa Ana, California airport drags the next week. I lost first round, but I got to see Bud Hare's fabulous double Triumph, double Triumph, and Chet Herbert's double engine Harley. Both ran 125 miles an hour. The first Nitro bike I saw was Chuck Suba's at Great Lakes Dragway, a Triumph 650. He set the absolute track record of 125. Soon, T.C. Christensen on his first 650 Norton drag bike won 127 at 1095 on pumped gas. In 1959, I started Sunset Motors. Our team went to Great Lakes Dragway almost every week. We won a lot. Once we entered and won all 6 motorcycle classes. I also won 10 state championships at the Wisconsin motorcycle rallies. In the early 60s, I was a Jaguar mechanic, and we had a dyno. We tuned race cars and drag cars, and a Jaguar that Formula One legend Dan Gurney drove to a win at Watkins Glen. After the Sports Car Center closed, TC bought the dyno, which helped us on our racing. In 1967, Stan Lump on a TT Bonneville, Larry Martin on a Harley XL-CH, and I on my Norton Cafe Racer rode to the Street Bike National Championship at Indianapolis Raceway Park. I won. Stan beat Larry in the semifinals and was runner-up. There were lots of trailer queens, but the guys from Great Lakes Dragway won and rode the 250 miles home together. Dennis Rolane taught me how to weld chromoly tubing, and I became a motorcycle frame builder. We couldn't make Nitro, we couldn't make Nitro work with streetcars. I went to Hilborn in California, and I talked them into helping adapt their midget fuel injection to TC's Norton. It became the first Hilborn motorcycle injection. Soon TC set a long-standing C-fuel 750cc record of 151 in 1985. I sold Hilborn injection to our Harley competition. TC was runner-up in top fuel at his first national. He beat the turnip eater Harley Davidson and became the Hog Slayer. We formed the Gregory and Christensen race team and built our first double-engine Norton Hog Slayer in 1968. We had clutch trouble, and it was too short. I became fairly successful racing it on gas. Most dragsters were using a Schaefer version of the Ford truck clutch. In 1969, I developed my 3-stage slider clutch and built a new Hog Slayer. A lot was lost to the only available 4-inch slick. Car tires affected the handling. In 1970, we set a 180-mile-an-hour Guinness record that stood for 6 years. At the Atco, New Jersey Motorcycle Nationals, we won top fuel, junior fuel, and top gas. Then we drove 3,000 miles to California and won the NHRA World Finals. Top fuel bikes were mostly high gear. I sold 25 clutches as fast as I could make them. Recently at a Route 66 NHRA National, a biker turned funny car clutch man pointed out that they're still using a modified version of my slider clutch. In 1972, we built a new double-engine 1620cc Norton Hog Slayer. It had the slider clutch, my new seamless shifting 2-speed, and the first M&H 6-inch motorcycle slick, followed by an 8-inch. We won in the USA and in Europe. TC and the Hog Slayer became world famous. There were many motorcycle magazine articles and also Hot Rod and Das Motor Rod, and a world press conference at the Savoy Hotel Ballroom in London. We became almost unbeatable. At first, the engines were good for 8 runs on Nitro. We kept working on them. In 1976, we made 161 runs on 98% Nitro. We won 11 of 13 races in the USA and Europe, and the first all 7-second win at the NHRA World Finals. The engines were still great. TC won 5 world championships. The Norton Hog Slayer is now in the British National Motorcycle Museum. In 1978, I built the first Harley Pro dragster in the 8s and a double-engine Harley for Danny Cooper. In Amsterdam, I designed and helped build a Gary Dreyer supercharged, Hilborn-injected, double-engine Kawasaki for European champion Hank Fink. It's now in the Audi Museum in Germany. In 1967, TC raced a modified Ducati street bike to 12th at Daytona. In 1968, I raced a converted Ducati Scrambler to 12th. Doesn't sound like much, but these were our first road races against the largest entry ever at Daytona Bike Week. I qualified 5th out of the fastest 225 riders all over the world. All the factories had special race bikes and top riders. I got 5th in my heat and 12th in the 75-mile final. Stock gear ratios and brakes were a problem. In 1992, TC's 64 Ducati found me. It was in boxes. I got it together and added racing brakes and a close racer gearbox and racing Arma. In 1997, I won the 250 Grand Prix at the Daytona Race of Champions. I also raced a Norton Commando, which is in the Motorcycle Museum. 1977, my son Willie won the Modified Street National Championship final at Great Lakes Dragway. He set a new record on his Moto Guzzi. In 2007, Broadway Bob said, "Didn't you set a bike record about 50 years ago?" I said, "Yes." And he replied, "Can you bring a bike out?" I brought my Norton Daytona bike and I missed my record by 200ths of a second. TC was inducted into the Motorcycle Hall of Fame in 2005. The Norton Hog Slayer has been a great ride and our ticket to adventure. In 2011, the Hog Slayer movie premiered and reached 5 stars on Amazon Prime. A new updated DV includes ABC Wild World of Sports coverage. Jody has some new DVs. The 10th anniversary homecoming showing will be at 8 p.m. on October 1st, 2022 at the Rotary Theater in downtown Kenosha. A party at 656 will follow. Thanks to all our helpers and all our sponsors and all my hot rod and motorcycle friends. And thank you all for coming.
1902 saw the introduction of the first Norton motorcycle in Britain. It was the infancy of motorcycle racing. The Norton racing tradition would eventually give birth to many legendary machines. One would take the drag racing world by storm. This Norton was not conceived at the factory. This Norton was not even designed in Britain. This Norton was different in nearly every way. This Norton was the Hog Slayer. This is the story of the legendary Hog Slayer and how it took command of the motorcycle drag racing world. T.C. Christensen and John Gregory, bench racing at its best from the original Sunset Motors.
Well, my first experience on a real drag race was at the Union Grove drag strip, and I had this hot rod street bike. The fastest thing at that race was actually a Vincent Black Shadow. And it gets down, that whole race got down to just me and that Vincent Black Shadow. We wind them things out. He shifts in a second, he misses second gear. I hit them all, I'm gone. I win the whole thing. So
TC was a good rider to start with, and I helped him hone his skills of getting off the line. He concentrated on being the world's best rider, which I think he was. I mean, I don't think anybody was better than him any place or any time after we went pro, or even before, as far as that goes.
me and John actually were pretty much teamed up to do this racing gig, and he was pretty much the brains behind all this equipment and stuff.
Motorcycle Weekly wrote, "Humiliation on the strips is what Tom Christensen inflicted on the rest of the world's dragsters. More than 3 miles a minute from a dead start in a mere quarter mile. It's difficult to imagine if you haven't seen it." Cycle World wrote, "John Gregory's abundant talents for imaginative engineering have produced the dazzling machines that launched T.C. Christensen on record-making rides. In charge of design and construction, John has created unique components, remarkable for their performance as well as their dependability." Unbridled courage.
Columbus, Ohio. And I get out there, get on the line, racing against another Harley guy. We blast off the line, I launch hard. So I shift into high gear and I wind that thing out about 1,100 feet off. Then I roll the throttle off and this bike goes into a death wobble. It's one of those wobbles that you know it's all over.
But, that was kind of scary. I wasn't up where I could see him close.
It goes to this big shake, it breaks off both of the steering stops. I mean, snaps them right off the frame like nothing.
We figured that the forks got into a shake so bad that it broke the fork stops and the fork turned sideways.
Keeps continuous on this big, it's going left to right, it's so hard, it's going in this big shake.
Next thing I seen the bike going back and forth, and he was like a rag doll on top of it, flapping back and forth. And
the front wheel is actually going sideways, it's throwing smoke into the fairing. I didn't even know what was going on. So just before I'm at a point where this bike's gonna pitch me off, I nailed the throttle, I grab a handful, the bike goes, comes in a big arc, straightens itself out. I'm getting lined up with the clocks. I can see the clocks. I'm straight on the drag strip, and I said, "This is the time to get off."
next thing he went down, the bike went one way and he went the other, you know.
Bang, I'm falling on my back. The bike's on my foot. I do a half donut, kick the bike off my foot, go shoot through the clocks at 150 miles an hour, smoking leathers, through the clocks. Bike comes through about 10 feet behind me at 149 and a half. So I slide on my stomach, and I slide on my back. I slide on my side, and I slide on that side. Then I'm saying to myself, geez, I'm going to go off the end of the track pretty soon. I've been out here sliding for half an hour now. And I finally come to a stop in a fetal position, holy. And then I'm smoking. I mean, I was so hot, the leathers were burning me. And later, I moved my neck a little bit. So I moved my back. Wow, cool. Hey, I got away with that one.
a pretty sad deal. I mean, I was really happy to see that he was walking. We just took him to the hospital and we kind of patched him up and we took him home.
The guy we raced against, he was watching the whole thing. And every time I see that guy at another track, he'd come up, TC, that was the greatest ride I've ever seen. You were up, you were down, you were sliding, you were gone. That was it.
Unrivaled innovation.
It was this combination of a lot of technically advanced equipment.
So that's when they developed the 2-speed. All you had to do was push the pedal and it would shift.
So we were one of the first bikes that actually went with a fat wheel.
We widened the frame out and put an 8-inch tire in the back.
Space age with chromoly frame, fuel injected, slipper clutches, 2-speed automatics.
We basically had to tune that Nitro bike like it was a street bike.
It was all stuff that people didn't had none of that at all. And that bike had all that stuff and it all working perfectly.
So the 3-speed was our next move. Actually, we didn't need it.
Unyielding challengers.
We went to pretty much all the big drag strips in the country that everybody hears about on TV, where the NHRA is. We went to Columbus, Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, and Indianapolis for the U.S. Nationals, and Ontario, California with the Super Nationals World Championship. We went out there and won it 4 times.
You talk about something wild, Coco. Have a look. They really burn it, don't they?
We won just about every race in the country multiple times. Then we went to England, and that was pretty impressive. I mean, TC revolutionized drag racing in Europe. We go out there and do about an 8-mile burnout, and they just freaked. They couldn't believe it.
You were the fastest man on 2 wheels in the world. You're still the fastest man on 2 wheels in Europe. Tom, can you tell us something about the design of the bike, and particularly the engines?
Well, the 2 750 Norton engines, which are made over here in Britain, and they're running about 150 horse apiece, which is probably 300 horse between them.
Well, the biggest thing at the racetrack always was the Harley Davidson. They were actually the king of the drag strips and stuff. And so the Hog Slayer was built and we're going to race it, and then we call it the Hog Slayer and challenge the Harley Davidson. We're sitting in a shop in Kenosha, Wisconsin, as they call it, in the shadow of the mighty Harley Davidson factory, and we're consistently beating off these Harleys. It wasn't just once in a while. We actually ran the records and beat these guys off for about almost 4 years in a row there. Yeah, actually, the R&D, research and development guys actually put a sign up in their research department that says, "Get the Hogs." One thing about that bike, anybody's ever seen it run, never forgot it. It was such a spectacle and what it did and how it did it.
Hog Slayer, the documentary.
They had a national for motorcycles here before we actually entered the national, and the top fuel champion was Leo Payne on a Harley Davidson. And on the side of his bike it said Turnip Eater, but turnip looked like a Triumph logo, you know, with the sweep down like that. So then when we were running gasoline at that time. So I went to Leo and I asked him, I said, "We want to try running nitro. Can you help me out?" He had like a chemistry set in his trunk, and he said, "Well, it's far too complicated, you won't understand." So R&B was building a rail job for a friend of Don Garrett's, and he told me how to run nitro. So we ran nitro at TC's first national, and he beat Leo the first round. So he said, at the Turnip Eater, he said, "I am the Hog Slayer." At the time we were racing, we were running 90 cubic inches on both engines, and the Harleys were having 102 on each engine. We still beat them. And we stole them all our equipment besides. One quick little story here. In the 90s, the bike hadn't been running probably 8 to 10 years. And TC hadn't ridden it either, of course. And some guys from Nova Scotia kept calling me, "You let it come out here and do an exhibition for us." So we went out there with the Hells Angels of Nova Scotia. And they treated us like kings, and they fed us and give us a lot of beer. And TC went up, the first time he'd ridden the bike now in all his time, and he went up to do his funny car style burnout over the line. And it felt so good he burned it out through the whole quarter mile. And the people went nuts with an old bike like that, but spin a 10-inch tire for a quarter mile. I guess that's it, huh? Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Jerry Newman is going to be our next speaker. So whenever you're ready, come on up.
Oh yeah, perfect. Good afternoon. They call these events geezer gatherings, and from the amount of gray hair, I feel quite that I fit right in. So good to be here. I got started in 1958, Union Grove Racetrack. Went down there with a friend who had an older brother with a Ford with a flathead in it, and went down and watched the drag races. I didn't realize it then, but later realized it was a match race between Garlitz and the Greek. So started out right at the top. In 1961, Chevy with a 301 in it. Came from a quarter-mile dirt track motor, built by John Schleeper, which is happy that he's here today. And I ran that for a little while, just in the summer, but really wasn't interested in driving, and really wasn't interested in gasoline. Already I was kind of interested by the Nitro cars. So I started hanging out
A little closer to the mic, Jerry.
With guys by the name of Engines Unlimited. And it was out of the hot rod shop in Milwaukee, Jack Tank and Fred Butsey primarily. And I just happened to be hanging around the car one day and watching them, and they were short of help, so Fred asked me to give him a hand, and so did some things like taking spark plugs out or whatever. And of course, door cars were done by then. That was no longer an interest. So raced with them, helped them in '62, and they ran quite good. They took the national record for a few months on gasoline from John Peters, if you remember the freight train, and Peters took it back, but that was quite an honor. In 1963, I started hanging out with a couple of guys by the name of Bruce Andrews and Del Fisher, and they were quite famous already with their Nitro, had a small block Chevy, and so I started as a crew guy for them, and actually the only one in those days. But that was my start on Nitro. I mixed my first nitromethane in 1963, and I guess we're pushing over 60 years here. The 1964, they got a new Garlitz car, and it was set up for a Chrysler engine, but we started with the Chevy, and ran Connie Kalita for a number 10 spot on the Drag News Mr. Eliminator list. And we normally ran about 25 to 30% in a small block Chevy. But of course Andy wanted to win, so he put about 40% in it. And we managed to blow all the rods out of it. And it was quite interesting because we were coming back from, I think it was New Jersey, and we'd go around the curve on the turnpike, and you'd hear this noise, and you'd look and you'd see maybe a rod or a piston or something falling out on the turnpike, because open trailers in those days. And so that was the end of the Chevrolets, and literally. And we went to a Chrysler. The car was built for a Chrysler. It was a twin to Garlitz's car. And we bought a complete pan-to-injector motor from the Greek. And so we had kind of the state-of-the-art chassis, and we had state-of-the-art motor in '64. And very, very successful. We were one of the first cars to run in the 7s, and we were one of the first cars to run over 200 miles an hour. Did that at Rockford. And won quite a few races, and very, very successful car. And gee, I thought it was easy, you know, this was going to be great. So learned that Nitro can be a little evil though, and wasn't that great in the future years. And so we built some cars again, and I got to meet quite a few fellas, interesting people. I had been a sleeper guy with growing up out in Waukesha County, but now those guys were with the hot rod shop. So now I had to go with the hot rod shop and meet the Milwaukee guys and learn the Milwaukee guys. One of the first guys I met was right in the area. They had a garage on 24th and Garfield, and Mike Marinoff was quite close by. And so I got to meet Mike. But Mike, you might say, kind of had an excitable personality. And some of the folks would enjoy kind of turning him up a little bit. And a matter of fact, his name, I don't know ever to his face, but was the Mad Russian. And a few stories on him. He was very early with the superchargers, and he ran what was called a Latham supercharger. Got to be really old to remember that. But it ran side draft carburetors, and he had gotten the carburetors at the hot rod shop. So one of the screws came out of the butterfly and went in and tore up his blower. So he came to the hot rod shop and he was ranting and raving, and they're going to have to pay him for a new supercharger and many things. And Bob Locksmith, one of the two owners, said, "Don't worry, Mike, we'll take care of it. I'll make it right." He went in the back and came back out and put a screw for the butterfly on the counter. And he said, here's a spare one to help you out. I believe that was the last time that Mike went to the hot rod shop. I'm not sure. But one other great story was there was a little cafe somewhere around there on 30th or 32nd or whatever, just around north of, okay. And we'd go there and Mike would hang out there, and I can still remember him sitting in the booth and he'd kind of guard his coffee cup. And so we went there one day to meet him for lunch or something, and talking about different stuff, and somebody said, "How do you think Nixon's going to do this year?" Mike said, "I don't know. What class does he run?" Pretty intense drag racer. Another fellow that we hung out with in those days was a guy by the name of Wally Kaufman, and he ran a Oldsmobile and then went to a Nitro car. Excuse me, a Chrysler. He was almost Nitro. Wally was quite interesting in that he towed with an Oldsmobile convertible, of course open trailers in these days, and when you opened the trunk for a toolbox, all he had was the lift-out tray out of the top of a toolbox. That's all he had for tools. But he also had a large cooler in there, and was full of Thunderbird wine. And one day I was talking to Wally, and I said, "You know, you don't have any tools or spare parts." I go, "What happens if you hurt it?" He goes, "We open the cooler." Which I think were things a little more relaxed in those days. Also at that time in '64 and '65, the races at Union Grove were immense. They were the largest in the United States. Huge amount of fuel cars came from all over the United States. Particularly then, that's the first time I got to see some California cars. And one of them was Stellingson, Hampshire. Quite beautiful car and very popular in those days. They came back, hung out with Bruce Andrews, went out drinking. The problem was, most of them drank Coors in those days, which was actually 3.2. And now they're in Milwaukee drinking Pabst. And Jeep Hampshire, the next morning at the drag strip, was sitting there looking like he was about ready to die. And he says, "I've never had a hangover like this in my life. I thought I could drink a lot of beer." But of course, we didn't realize or didn't tell him about 3.2 versus 0.6. Another time, that same era, we would be drinking beer in the pits after the race. And the California guy said, "You know, you can drink beer in the pits?" I go, "Oh yeah." And aren't you afraid of the track owner, promoter, you know? I always said, you got to really be careful about him. He said, will he throw you out? He said, no, he'll drink your beer. Which I think you all know how true that was. About the same time, I think 1965, there was a famous drag racer by the name of Don Mad Dog Cook. I don't know how he got the name Mad Dog, but he certainly lived up to it. And he was a touring professional and actually hung out at Great Lakes Dragway quite a bit and worked on his car out of the Greeks. And he was telling us about a thing that he had for a little excitement. He had weather balloons. They were pretty thick rubber, and they were used by the National Weather Service to send them up and measure the atmosphere as they were going up. And but he found a better use for them. He would use 3 of them. He'd fill one with helium for the lifter, and then one with acetylene, and then one with oxygen. And he'd put about a 6 or 7 foot primer cord in the acetylene one, and he'd lift them off. And he said that it would produce a ball of fire, you know, huge diameter, like a air balloon or something like that, a hot air balloon. So of course this was right up Bruce Andrews' alley. He just thought this sounded like the greatest deal. So he was asking Cook about it, and Cook says, oh, I got some balloons right here in the truck. So he gets them out, and you want to try it? And well, of course. So on Monday, this after the race, Andy went and found a bottle of hydrogen or helium somewhere. And Tuesday, Don came up from Chicago, and we proceeded to build this weather balloons. And the best part about the story is just as we're getting ready to do this, Don is filling the helium balloon. It says you always got to test your lifter, because you don't want too much or it'll go up too fast, and you make sure you got to have enough, you know. And so, okay, fine, so he gets it all ready. And we're on 24th and Garfield in an alley back there at a shop. And so we load this baby up. It's about, I don't know, maybe 10 o'clock at night. Hot summer day in July probably. And so we put this thing in, put the fuse in, we light it off. And it goes up. Trouble is, it only goes up about 300-400 feet. To which Don says, oh shit. And we didn't quite understand that, but that pretty much meant that he screwed up on the lifter. And so he jumped in his truck and left. This thing goes up about 200 feet, maybe 300 feet if that, and starts floating down the alley going towards 27th Street. Gets out to somewhere around 27th Street, I don't remember, and there's this immense ball of fire. Broke some windows. Of course, we all ran inside, closed the doors, turned out the lights. Next day or the day after, there was just a short little piece in the journal, someplace in the back page, about a mysterious explosion in the area of 27th Street. But they weren't able to find any damage. And so that was kind of the end of our weather balloon thing. In 1966, Del and Andy built a Garlett's car, another new one, and it was one of the first 200-inch wheelbase cars in the United States. And it had the engine put up right against the rear wheels, because we ran a lot of slippery tracks in those days, and plus Bruce Andrews thought he was making more power than anybody in the United States, and so we put the motor way at the back. Garlett's told him it'll never work with a 392. You're going to have to run a stroker motor in it. It just won't work. And after one season, we determined that Garlett's was right and knew what he was talking about, because this was kind of the most ill-handling thing you ever saw. It when it was smoking the tires, leaving the starting line, still in those days, it would get out there about 300 feet and try to hook up the tires, and it would turn right or left or go straight, and Del never knew which one. So that was the end of that. We gotta send it back to Garlett's. Garlett's says, I'll take it back because I got a guy that wants to do the same thing, and I'll just sell it to him. And so Garlitz built us a new car, identical to his again. And we, of course, came right back and started running good again. An interesting sidelight to this is when we had the Chevrolet in it, it had a very long clutch pedal in it, so that Del could work the clutch and slip the clutch so it wouldn't bog down and hurt the motor, bog the car. We still had that, of course, when we put the Chrysler in it. And instantly we started running unbelievably good. This was before the days of the slipping clutch. But we later determined that, of course, it was Del. Because after the first season, we take the clutch apart. Of course, in those days, we ran a 2-disc clutch and virtually never changed it. And Andrews gets on Del and goes, "What the hell's the matter here? We're killing this clutch. We can't afford this." He says, "Are you taking your foot off the clutch pedal?" And Del goes, "No, I kind of just ride it a little bit like I did with the Chevy." He said, "Well, this is a Chrysler. It's not a Chevy. Take your foot off the clutch pedal." And he did. And we instantly slowed up. And so all this talk about who invented a slipping clutch and Keith Black and all that wasn't quite the case. But then we get this new car in '66, and the clutch pedal comes bolted to the bell housing, no linkage. So we put the thing together. Fisher can't push the clutch in because it's got a clutch pedal now from Garlitz, and 9-disc clutch and all this. It can't push the clutch in, no linkage. So Andy calls him. I can still remember I'm in the shop there, and Andy's on the phone to Garlitz, because of course I called him every Monday, and complaining about this car with no clutch linkage. Fisher can't put the clutch in. Garlitz says, "Oh, no, I'm going to tell you something now. Don't you be spreading this around. But what you do is you take 3 springs out of the clutch," which we had 9 in those days. You take 3 springs out of the clutch, and in those other 6 springs, you mill the seat down in donut about another 1/8 of an inch or so, actually taking the tension off the springs. Then you take the 3 levers, which is all we ran, and you take a 1-inch long piece of 1/4-inch Allen wrench, and you weld it on those levers, which of course was the counterweight to lock it back up then. And he said, "It's going to kind of slip, but it'll still smoke the tires, but it works really good. Don't tell anybody about it." And of course, Bruce, being the brilliant person he was, hung up the phone, looked at me, and said, "I believe Garlitz is starting to lose it." And so naturally we built clutch linkage. And we're a couple of years later before we ever got onto a slipping clutch. 1966 was my first time as a tuner. We had sold a '65 car to a guy in Milwaukee who came by Bruce and wanted to build a wheel stander. But before he left, Bruce had talked him into he should really have a fuel dragster, and he could make a lot more money. And so he bought our '65 car. In '66, we were getting run Union Grove and Memorial Day weekend, which was a huge race even in those days. But the '66 car wasn't quite finished. They were still building the motor and getting things ready. So Bruce said to me, "Okay, you go down to Union Grove with him." This was on a Friday night. You know, make sure he can run the car and that kind of stuff. A guy by the name of John Tunison was driving it, and you remember those days. And so we go down there on Friday night, and don't know why, but we ended up the 3rd low ET. Probably out of about 25 or 30 cars. And so I got back to the shop on Saturday to tell Bruce what happened, and he said, "You're never going with that car again." And so, but that was my first time with tuning. Changed the jet in it and mixed the nitro a little bit and tuned a nitro fuel car on my own. Then in we had the riots in '67. That was pretty much the end of, it was July of '67. And we were on 24th and Garfield, and so Bob Locksmith, who owned the car and had some money in it, said, "Get that thing out of there, bring it down to the hot rod shop," which in those days were on 40th and Greenfield. And so we dragged everything out of there and took it down to the hot rod shop, And Bruce didn't really want any part of that. So it's kind of the end of Bruce, and the locksmith said, "You think you can run it?" I don't know, but I'll try. And so we didn't run anymore in '67, but '68 we started out a little bit, ran it a few times, and didn't really know what we were doing and didn't do that great. But my only real claim to fame was that year, '68, in the fall, we went to Indiana to the U.S. Nationals, and I went with John Butera, who had built his own car and was beginning to build a chassis for me for '69. So we went down there, and first run we blew all the rods out. And so John had gotten a deal. He had gotten free Anson rods and pistons and pins. Broke all the pins. So we go down to the hotel. We were staying at the Holiday Inn in downtown Indianapolis because there wasn't many hotels out around Brownsburg in those days. And we're switching motors. We did have a spare short block. And we're in the parking lot, and of course all the fans and everybody are up on the railings of your typical two-story Holiday Inn, and they're all watching us. And so about 2 in the morning, we get this thing back together. Well, naturally you got to start it, because you know you're not going to go out to the racetrack never starting it. So there's an alley between the hotel and these other commercial buildings out on pretty much downtown Indy. So we push it up the alley backwards, and then we push it down the alley to start it. Well, there's all gravel and dirt and everything in the alley. You let out the clutch, it's sliding the tires and popping and not wanting to start. So, of course, we don't quit. About the third time, it starts. John goes down past the Holiday Inn and stops, and there's about this 5-story high brick building. And we sit there and whack the throttle a few times and all that kind of stuff and shut it off. And now we're pushing it backwards up the alley. I'm right by the injector. And there's squad cars coming in every direction. I thought, boy, these people are pretty sensitive, you know. And one of them pulled up right next to us with a dog in it. And the dog was not very nice either. He was trying to break out the window. But we keep going, we keep pushing back. This cop comes up, and of course, I'm sure it isn't true, but he must have looked about 6'7" or 6'8". And we keep pushing, we don't stop, and he looks at me and says, "Did you start this thing?" What am I going to say? It's hot? So I says, "Yeah." "You're going to start it again?" I said, "Oh no, we're done." He says, "That's right, because if you start it again, you and it are going to jail." Fully understand, sir. So we get back by the trailer and putting things away and stuff. And the security guard, which they had those days, because this was downtown Indiana even in those days, security guard comes back because he had kind of wandered off when we were getting ready to do this. And so he came back and he's looking, and I go, "What's the deal with all the cops? You know, I can't believe this." He goes, "Well, you know where that brick building is where you stop?" I go, "Yeah." He says, "That's a bank." And evidently it set off all the burglar alarms. So naturally they were responding to the bank and not us. But that was my most memorable event at Indy. In '69 to '71, I ran my own car, R&B car, front engine car, and we ran mostly the UDRA fueler circuit, which was quite big at that time, and ran a lot of races in the Midwest. And of course, quite a few times at Union Grove. And so that's when I really started to deal with Bob Metzler. Now, I know there's a lot of folks here that thought that Bob was really great, and what a great promoter, and what a great guy, but I don't believe any of those folks ever dealt with him on money, because Bob was a quite typical track promoter. And in those days, there was a thing about getting your money cut. There was always a reason to cut your money. Now, Bob was known for paying very good money, and he did. He shows in the big names. But also, when you went to get paid, he had a guy there with notes and stuff, and would tell you where you shut the car off. And of course, if you shut the car off early, well, that would be less money because I was paying you for full runs. I wasn't paying you for part runs. So you always had that negotiation. I think, I'm not sure the year, but I think it was about 1973, maybe 72. And you used to have to stand out at this little building on the way out. That was his office where he would pay you. And there would be a line out the door and up the steps, and you'd wait your turn to go in, and Bob would pay you because everybody had different deals. It was all booked in different deals. Well, this one time there was a gentleman by the name of R.L. Payton. I don't know if any of you folks remember R.L. Payton, but he was, rather than famous, I would say notorious. And he came from Florida originally, but he ultimately died of lead poisoning because somebody shot him in Alabama. But he was a pretty tough guy, but ran good, ran a fuel dragster. So he goes in to get paid. And I'm standing there, I think it was with Tommy Ivo, I don't remember exactly. But we're standing, we're about 3 or 4 people outside the door, off the steps. And all of a sudden, Bob used to have a security guy there. I don't know if he was real or rent-a-cop, but he did have a gun and he did have some kind of badge. A short little guy with glasses, not me. And this guy comes running out the door, right over in the grass, and starts throwing up. Hey, what's this all about? So that was about it. We go in and get paid and stuff. The next week, I'm talking to Bob's right-hand guy there, his kid, who used to be up on the starting line and used to keep track of it, what was going on for Bob. I said, what was this deal with the cop throwing up and all that stuff? Well, Metzler started talking to R.L. Payton about cutting his money. And R.L. says, you ain't going to cut my money. Matter of fact, you want to talk about that? I'll maybe just take all your money. And Bob said, well, now wait a minute, be careful, I got security here. And so R.L. was standing right next to the security guy and produces a gun out of somewhere and sticks it in the guy's ear and says, first I'm going to blow his brains all over this wall, and then I'm going to take all the money. And that was the end of that negotiations. Bob was a great promoter, there's no doubt about that. And I often wondered how he had such pull with even the Milwaukee papers and stuff, because he would get great sports articles and people, and he would have them down, some of the writers and things, down to the racetrack, but we didn't have any fancy suites and things like that now in hospitality areas for that kind of stuff. So Bob put on a press party, which he did several of them, and this was in West Dallas, right on Greenfield Avenue, about, I don't remember, 72nd or 3rd or 4th. There was a hotel there. And I don't know how he did it, but he got West Dallas to close off part of the street there, Greenfield Avenue. And we had our top fuel car there and had Charlie Proit with the Telstar, Russell Long, did a burnout on Greenfield Avenue. Good old days, I guess. But the 2 things I remember from that is the hotel had a nice big window, which must have been a coffee shop, probably 6 foot by 8 foot, plate glass window. When Charlie did the burnout, sent a crack right up through that 8-foot window. I thought it was impressive, it was good. So that was it. Later in the day, I'm there talking to Bob. And I don't remember who it was, don't remember his name, but he was like the sports director for Channel 4. And he was out there. And he came up to Bob and he said, is the key still available? I'd like to do a follow-up on the interview. Okay, fine. Bob reaches his pocket, gives him a key. I must have been looking at Bob with kind of a strange look on my face. I go, interview and a key? Metzler looks around and he goes, I've got a hooker up in the room. He says, it works good for influence. Great promoter, great promoter. Knew how to do it. Got a lot of coverage from the sports writers. So then that was pretty much the end of my association with Bob, except for I was negotiating with him one time. He wanted to pay me less because I was close by. I was just close to the drag strip. Why would he pay me as much as those guys from California? I tried to tell him, Bob, you know, Nitro cost me the same, tires, clutch, everything cost me the same. Maybe I save a little gasoline driving down here, but I don't save anything racing here as a local guy. Well, he would still always try to work me. And so I said to him, well, you know, a lot of times when you need a car and for a display or something like that, or an interview, one time I was Don Garlitz on the radio, another time I talked about racing my jet dragster on the radio. Fortunately, no pictures and not many questions. When I got some questions about the jet engine from somebody who knew, I said, oh, I got a guy who works on airplanes, takes care of my jet engine, so I really don't know. But I was arguing with Bob and wanting more money, and I said, come on, Bob, you know, if you don't pay me, I'm not going to be doing all this other stuff on the side during the week or weekends or whatever. So you know, you got to give me more money. So he said, okay. He says, I got a deal for you. I got a TV show I need you to do. Oh, great, you know. You go down to Channel 4, this was like 2 weeks later on a Saturday, and go down to Channel 4 on Capitol Drive there, and do a deal, bring the race car and all that kind of stuff. So, gee, I was quite impressed. This was going to be great. So we go down there and get the car on the trailer. Turns out the TV program, it isn't a sports program, it's called Kids Club. There's probably about 50 kids. But the highlight of the deal was he had Ronald McDonald there. And these kids are grabbing Ronald McDonald and hanging on him and just going crazy. Ended up he did a thing with the race car, Ronald did. So he comes over to look at it and he says, how's it going? And he's got 3 or 4 little kids hanging on him and pulling on him and tugging on him. He looks at me and he goes, you know, this is a hell of a way to make a buck. I always thought about Ronald McDonald whenever I see him somewhere. So, that was pretty much my Union Grove and Bob Metzler stories. Of course, continued to run for him there many years. But in 1977, in my other life, I also was a construction guy, and I built buildings and hospitals and things like that. And I was moving up in the corporate world, and so I got quite a promotion. I got put in charge of the southern half of the United States, and I lived in Florida. And so I parked my race cars and did that. But during that time, a real good friend of mine by the name of Carl Olson worked for NHRA, and I would help him at the NHRA national events. I would work in the sponsors program, the contingency money, and one time at the U.S. Nationals, what we would do is we would take VIPs, and this time I got Edsel Ford, not the car, but the person. And we would bring them in and first take them for a ride on the go-kart and show them how the racers all come in the back gate and where tech was, and then we'd take them down the return road and show them what happens on the other end, and then we'd take them and show them how the spectators come in and all of this, selling NHRA drag racing. So that was quite an honor to meet and ride around with Edsel Ford for a while. So I did that up until 1983. And then I got promoted, and corporate headquarters was in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so I moved to Minnesota and was doing that. Now I'm flying all over the United States, flying almost every day of the week. And I thought, you know, I know my old friend Doc Holliday that I knew from Union Grove. He was from Minnesota. And I think I'll see if I can look him up. So I looked up, I knew he had the trailer place, and I found Roadway Trailers in the phone book, no internet. And looked out the window for the address, and it was right across the Minnesota River. I could see it from my office. So I went down and re-met Doc and talked with him and stuff, and he says, why don't you come help us? He was running the Telstar Funny Car at that time. He had purchased everything from Charlie. Well, actually, I won't speak bad of Charlie at the moment, but if you knew Charlie, he probably owed you money. And as Doc would run the car, Charlie would always borrow money from him. Even though he was paying him to drive it, he'd borrow money for him, sometimes for gas just to get to the drag strip. So he'd want the payout money so he could buy gas to get home. Well, Doc kind of ended up almost owning everything, and at least by loaning Charlie money. And ultimately, Charlie wanted to quit, and so Doc took over the whole operation, and that's where Doc ended up with the Telstar. So I go down by Doc and meet him and talk and stuff, and he goes, hey, at that time, Bill Shifsky was running the car for him, and he says, you know, why don't you come to the drag races with us? And I go, well, okay, maybe I will. And I was fortunate in that I was flying all the time, so I would just route myself somewhere in the United States so I could go to wherever he was racing, mostly match racing in those days, although it did run a little bit of IHRA and AHRA. And so that's how I got started, back into Nitro and that stuff. And in 1985, Bill Shifsky was doing quite good with his trailer business and just didn't want to do it anymore and didn't want to travel. And Doc said, you know, do you think you could run it for me? I said, well, yeah, you know, I never ran a funny car in my life, but been watching this and it's Nitro and we'll give it a try. So I started running the car. And actually we became quite successful. 86, we were the AHRA funny car champion. And that was with guys like McEwen and Hawaiian. And once in a while the Stink, not much. Once in a while the Chi-Town Hustler, pre-Force, and we did quite well, and we were the AHRA World Champion, for which we got 2 jackets. Oh well, we're still champion. And we started running IHRA, NHRA, and match races. AHRA went away. And we were running about 30 dates a year. This is part-time. I got a job, Doc's got business, 30 dates. So we were quite busy. But we did good. 3 years in a row, we finished #2 in IHRA. And again, against some pretty big names, Ed McCullough, Candyson Hughes. But we did real well. I had a quite dependable combination. We hardly ever hurt the car. That was kind of because Doc wouldn't buy parts, but really developed so it wouldn't hurt itself. And it was very good on slippery tracks. So we never tried to run low ET or beat the world or anything. We just tried to get, nowadays they say A to B, but we just tried to get down the track. And it was quite successful because the bigger guys once in a while or many times would smoke the tires or have to pedal the car or whatever, and we'd be driving right down through there. And we did quite well. Also, I got known at that time for being very dependable and not blowing stuff up. And that's when I started my Nitro helper services, because I had several funny car guys coming over to me and asking me about tips for this and for that. And so that's when I started the business and selling tune-ups and combinations and tuning at the tracks. I had a customer, one of the first guys I switched from alcohol to Nitro, and I've ended up doing quite a few of those, was Bob Gilbertson out of Charlotte, North Carolina. And I would do the car combination, engine combination, then train crew members and teach them how to do all that kind of stuff. And that got to be quite successful in the later 80s, early 90s. Again, in 2003, corporate America started calling again, and I got offered a very good job. However, it was in Asia. I was going to be in charge of Asia. So again, that was the end of the drag racing. However, while I was over there, I did participate with NHRA. We brought cars to Japan. I don't know if you remember any of that, but we brought Top Fuel cars and cars to Japan for exhibition stuff, and I was part of that. I was also working with one of the sons of the president of Indonesia, who was a racer guy, actually had built a Formula 1 track, and they were running street cars on the straightaway in drag racing. So I got introduced to him, and I was working on a program to bring Nitro cars from Australia to Indonesia and try to promote Nitro drag racing in Indonesia. But unfortunately, in 1997, the currency collapsed in Asia. Not many people know what it was like here, but it was devastating. And everything just stopped. And so that was the end of my time in Indonesia. I went to Cairo, Egypt, and opened an office down there, and I was in Cairo for about 8 months. But they wanted me to stay, but I had more than enough. And so I quit and I came back to the States. I did a hospital out in California, and then decided to come back to Lannon, Wisconsin, my birthplace. Had pretty much enough of California, plus my next project, I did a hospital up on the side of a mountain in Sonora, which was beautiful, fantastic, by Yosemite National Park. But my next project was going to be the R.L. White Hospital in East Los Angeles. And the first 3 floors, existing hospital, we're going to do addition on it, the first 3 floors had bulletproof glass in them from the ricochets out in the street and alleys and around there. And so I thought about it a little bit, and I thought, you know, Lannon, Wisconsin looks a whole lot better. So I left them, and I came back to Lannon, and had my own little development company. And also I ran for and was village president for a while, plan commission because of my building experience. And in 2007, I was out at the NHRA national event in Las Vegas. I had gone out there both for the event and to go to Las Vegas, and that was the time of the SEMA show and that kind of stuff. And I went out there, and Doc happened to be there, and so we were walking around together. And we were very close with Del Worsham when he was just a young 17-year-old kid, and his dad, Chuck. But we ran a lot of IHRA races together with them. And NHRA had just started this nostalgia cars. And for the funny cars, the combination was almost identical to what we ran in 86 and 87. And we're walking around, and we go by Del Worsham, talking to him, and he goes, "You guys got to build one of these nostalgia cars." "Oh, really? Why is that?" "Oh," he says, "it's the same combination you used to run." He says, "You'd be great." He says, "It's great. It's perfect. You got to do this." And they had just built the Blue Max nostalgia car at that time. And so Doc says, "Well, I still got the car. It's sitting up on top of my office on the roof." And, you know, he says, "I can put it back together. Are you going to tune it?" I go, "Well, yeah, I guess I'll try." And here we are, 2008, back burning nitro again, going down the highway. And we were quite successful with it. And soon I get guys asking me to help them tune again. So Nitro Helper Services came back again. And that's pretty much what I've been doing now. We still run the Telstar. I was quite successful in about 2012 to 2014. I was tuning 14 cars around the United States and in the world. And still do have one in Sweden and one in England and a few in Australia, and of course quite a few here. I'm down to 5 to 7 cars right now, but so it was quite a deal. It worked out quite fine, and it was the right combination. Now in 2013, I got involved with quite a phenomenon now that you're all aware of called cackle cars. And there was a gentleman in Minnesota called by the name of Steve Anderson who put together or restored a 1966 Tom Hoover car. And spent just a hell of a lot of money and a lot of effort to do this. And so ended up being declared the most beautiful field dragster in the country by Hot Rod Magazine, and it's pretty nice. So Steve asked me, I knew him through Doc Holliday and stuff, and would I do the engine, well, not the engine was built, but the fuel combination and that kind of stuff, and help him with that. So I said, sure. So I helped him with that, and it was okay, but he ran it exactly like in 1966. And which was what he wanted, exactly that. Even had a camshaft from 1966. And so we went out to California with it to the reunion in Bakersfield. And Steve is a friend of Steve Gibbs. And so we were one of the featured cars at the Golden Lion reception on Friday night. They would start 10 cars. And so we were part of that. And when I had originally talked to Steve, you know, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to make this thing thunder, or do you just want it to run or what? He said, oh, no. I just want it to be like it was in '66, and just, that's all, just not hurt anything and stuff. Okay, fine, we can do that. So we go to California, and of course the 9 other cars that are at the Golden Lion have been doing this for quite a few years already. And they all sound pretty good. They've got some pretty decent flames, and we kind of sounded like a big block Chevy with no mufflers, you know, and quite embarrassing actually, but that's what it was. And so we get back to the Midwest here. About 2 weeks later, Steve Anderson calls me and says, can you do something with this thing? He says, I was never so embarrassed in my life. And I said, oh, certainly, you know, I got a lot of ideas and a lot of things I can do. He says, well, do whatever you want. He says, just don't hurt it, but do whatever you want. So I started working on the tune-up. And one of my goals was to make it sound like the Surfers. Because in 1966, the Surfers was the loudest, best sounding nitro car in the United States. It was just unbelievable. And I said, okay, let me, you know, that would be my goal, to make it sound like that. And so I started working on it and changing things, and over the years now we've changed quite a few things. And kind of one of my highlights of my careers was about 4 years ago. They were out at the Nitro Revival, California, and Steve Job was there. Tom Job was there. We've recently lost him, but he was the brains behind the Surfer car. And every time you'd start the car, Tom Job would be there and start walking around and coming there. And so finally he was talking to Steve about, you know, what's this and all that kind of stuff. And Steve really didn't know anything about the engine combination. And of course I had always told him, anybody asks you about it technically, you tell them you don't know nothing. You know, you got some guy that does it, you just sit in it. And so Tom said, you know, that's the most spectacular sounding car I've ever heard. He says, if that car would have showed up in 1966 and sounded like that at Lions, we would have packed up and left. And so I think my goal was accomplished. It puffed me up like the Goodyear blimp. And so to this day, we're still doing that on that particular car. I've got 4 other country that I've been helping guys with. And we went to the revival last year in Irwindale, California. There was about 70 nitro cars there, capital cars there, and we were judged the best, and which didn't make a lot of California guys happy, but sure made me feel good. And for those of you who've heard it or seen it on the internet, it's pretty impressive. I'm quite pleased. And so that's my life. Nitro and drag racing in Union Grove. Thank you very much.
Great.
Before we go back out to fire up the cars, I'd like to have Richard come up to the podium for a minute. You only got 2 minutes, though. And then I want Brian to come up and talk a little bit about his street nitro coupe. Richard, just let us know how you got your start in drag racing and how you ended up with an exhibition wheel.
Started probably in the early 50s. We had a junkyard, so we had plenty of race cars. And my first, we ran on airports, and I was following Garlitz one day. And back then he tow barred his cars. He didn't have a trailer. Battery fell out and I ran over it on the way to the track, but he got over that. Then I got into it. Started with a model, a 34 Ford with a 100 horsepower motor in it. And then, you know, when you go there, you want to go faster every week. So I ended up with later on, I ended up with a dragster. For 1 week, I didn't like that, but I was in a position where I could have any type of race car I wanted, you know, as far as to start with one. So I ended up actually running a 40 Studebaker gas car. And things changed, and finally I decided to build a wheel standard. There's only two out there at the time. You had the Little Red Wagon and the guy from Tennessee, or South Carolina, I'm sorry. And so I went and bought a brand new truck. I didn't know, you know, that was illegal. Because when you buy a truck and finance it, you're not supposed to make a race truck out of it. But I did, and the insurance man called me up. He said, I'm not going to turn you in, but he said, whatever you do, don't crash it. So I never did crash it. Matter of fact, it's still here. It's somewhere in Chicago, sitting in an alley somewhere. And so that's all I've done since 1966 was run wheel standards. And I just run all over the country and out of the country and have a good time. At one time I ran, they were basically outlaw cars. You're going to die in one of those, because that was when everybody was trying to run hydrazine, and hydrazine will kill you. You know, 5%. If I started out here, 5% will kill you. And that's how I get out of this here, because that's not a safe deal. And I think back in that era, I witnessed 3 or 4 guys get killed or just died from the fumes. But other than that, I'm still running a wheel standard. I'm up here, going to be running, what is it, 2 weeks? 2 weeks from now, or be my last run up here. I lived in Florida all my life, then I moved to Georgia, and I'm up here now for a while. Thank everybody for coming out.
Kohlmann. My first time that I went to Union Grove, my brother won some tickets off the radio, WRKR. We were too poor to actually afford to go to the track, but we got lucky and won some tickets and went out there. I really wasn't even sure what I was looking at. I remember there were some jet cars and a rocket car and some other stuff. I thought it was pretty cool. Then in high school, I had a friend who had a GTO, and I'd ride to school every day in that thing, and it scared the death out of me, so I figured I had to get something like that. And that led to me getting a 66 Chevelle, and I'm not really sure why my dad co-signed the loan for that thing, but he let me get the Chevelle, and I still have it to this day. Then moving up a couple years into the 90s, I really got into super stock in early funny cars, and ended up building a 64 Plymouth that I drove on the street and raced on the street and took it to the Grove, and then things just got out of control. I ended up putting an injected wedge in the thing, and it went about 950s, and then I decided I wanted an altered wheelbase car, and I bought a 65 Dodge, and that turned into a blown Nitro car, and that's what really got me into the Nitro stuff, and that was really crazy. And that car actually, with a stock frame and suspension, went 740s. That was a lot of fun. And then there was some time off, but I did help other people. Dale with the Orange Crate, the front engine car, I worked on his car for quite a bit, crewing on that. And then I got the idea I needed a street car again, so I got my 31 Chrysler, and I drove that around with an early Hemi and put 8 Strombergs on that thing, and with a stick it would go in the high 9s. That was a lot of fun. And then we ended up damaging the thing in a street race in Detroit, and I ended up going to the chassis service and talking to Jim Quinn, and told him I needed a chassis that I could go 200 miles an hour in. If I crashed the thing, I might be able to limp away from the wreck. So that's how we ended up with what we have outside. And that was designed to work with Nitro right off the bat. I told Jim I wanted a fuel tank in the front, I wanted a radiator in the trunk, and wanted to be able to do drag week and pull a trailer with that thing on drag week. And he built a fantastic chassis, and with the early Hemi it went in the 7s, and then we split the block right down the middle. I mean, the crankshaft almost fell right out of the thing. So I got the late model KB, and we put that in the car, and now that car's gone in the 6s, and I can still pull a trailer, I can still drive it around, and the cool thing is I can start it up on gas with the 12-volt battery and roll it over the Nitro and race it, and I can flip it back to the gas and never shut the thing off. I can just go around in circles on the track. So it's a lot of fun. It's kind of different, unique. I'm sure it's the only one in the country. And we still continue to run the thing, and this coming weekend, if you're not doing anything, it'll be racing at Eddyville, Iowa for the Fuel Internationals. We can see what my little street car does against some of these big cars. So we're going to start it up outside. Come out and smell some nitro.